The village of Millhaven had been dying for 3 weeks when Dr. Serafina Cross arrived with nothing but a worn leather satchel and 2 centuries of medical knowledge that she wasn't supposed to possess. The plague had swept through the settlement like wildfire, claiming the young and old first, leaving behind a handful of desperate survivors who had given up hope of seeing another sunrise. She found them huddled in the village church, 23 souls clinging to life and each other, their faces gaunt with fever and despair. The local priest, Father Benedict, was among the afflicted, his prayers reduced to whispered gasps as he tried to comfort the dying children in his arms. "Please," he whispered when he saw her silhouette in the doorway, backlit by the pale morning sun. "If you're here to loot, take what you want. Just don't disturb the dead." Serafina stepped into the church, her enhanced senses immediately cataloging the symptoms, the particular scent of the fever, the rhythm of labored breathing, the way the light hurt their eyes. She'd seen this plague before, in Prague in 1847, in London during the cholera outbreaks, in countless villages across Europe where death had come calling with methodical precision. "I'm not here to take anything, Father," she said softly, kneeling beside a child who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "I'm here to help." "Are you a physician?" "I am." She opened her satchel, revealing vials of medicine that shouldn't have existed for another 50 years, herbs that grew only in the remotest corners of the world, and instruments crafted with a precision that spoke of supernatural enhancement. "And I'm going to save every person in this room." It was a promise she'd made before, in circumstances just like these, a promise that had sustained her through 2 centuries of defying everything her kind stood for, of choosing human life over vampire law, of becoming the thing the council feared most, a vampire who cared. She worked through the day and into the night, her hands steady and sure as she administered treatments, adjusted dosages, and whispered words of comfort in languages both ancient and modern. One by one, the fevers broke. One by one, the dying began to breathe easier. One by one, she pulled them back from the edge of the abyss. By dawn, 23 people who should have been dead were sitting up, taking water, asking for their families. Father Benedict wept openly as he watched her pack her satchel, his hand shaking as he tried to find words adequate to express his gratitude. "How?" he asked simply. "How did you do this?" "Knowledge," Serafina replied, which was true enough, "and practice." "You're an angel," whispered the child she'd treated first, a little girl with golden curls and eyes the color of summer sky. "Mama said angels come to help when everything seems lost." Serafina's heart clenched at the innocent faith in those words. If only the child knew what she really was. A creature of darkness who had spent 2 centuries trying to atone for the monster she'd been born to be. "Not an angel, sweetheart," she said gently, smoothing the girl's hair. "Just someone who believes that every life matters." It was as she was leaving the village that she felt it, the familiar chill that ran down her spine when another of her kind was near. Old instincts, honed by centuries of survival, screamed at her to run, but she was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of living in the shadows of her own good intentions. She turned to face the figure emerging from the tree line, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall and lean, with the kind of predatory grace that marked the most dangerous of their kind. His hair was black as midnight, his skin pale as moonlight, and his eyes were the color of winter storms, cold and merciless and beautiful in the way that deadly things often were. He wore dark clothes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and at his side hung a sword that had clearly tasted blood more times than she cared to count. But it wasn't his appearance that made her blood run cold. It was the silver pendant hanging around his neck, bearing the seal of the Vampire Council's Enforcement Division. She knew what that pendant meant, just as she knew why he was here. "Dr. Serafina Cross," he said, his voice carrying the faint accent of old nobility and the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "By order of the Vampire Council, you are under sentence of death for crimes against our kind." "Executor," she replied, inclining her head slightly. It wasn't a question. She could smell the violence on him, could see the weight of countless kills in the way he held himself. "I've been expecting you." "Have you?" His storm-gray eyes studied her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Then you know why I'm here. To kill me for the crime of saving human lives." "Yes," I'm aware of the charges. Treason against the vampire nation, violation of the laws of separation, interference in human affairs resulting in the preservation of lives that should have been allowed to perish naturally. He recited the charges with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this many times before. The penalty is death by silver blade, to be carried out immediately upon apprehension. And yet, Serafina observed, I'm still breathing. Something flickered across his expression, too quickly for her to identify, but it was there. You are. May I ask why? The executor was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the village where smoke was beginning to rise from chimneys as the survivors started their first normal day in weeks. When he looked back at her, there was something in his eyes that might have been uncertainty. I watched you, he said finally. For 3 days I observed your work in that village. I saw you save 23 lives without asking for payment, gratitude, or recognition. I saw you risk exposure, exhaustion, and capture to help creatures that most of our kind consider little better than livestock. And for the first time in 500 years of service to the council, I find myself questioning my orders. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they wanted to cross. Serafina studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too much death for too long. What are you proposing? She asked carefully. 7 days, he said. You have 7 days to convince me that your life is worth more than the laws you've broken. 7 days to prove that what you do serves a greater purpose than the order the council maintains. And if I can't convince you, then I fulfill my duty and you die. And if I can, then... He paused, clearly struggling with the implications of what he was offering. Then we find another way. Serafina felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. It was dangerous, she knew. Hope had a way of making you careless, of making you believe in possibilities that existed only in dreams. But looking at this deadly beautiful creature who had just offered her a chance at life, she found herself willing to take that risk. 7 days, she agreed. But I have conditions. His eyebrows rose slightly. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Aren't I? You need something from me, Executor, or you would have killed me already. You need me to justify your doubts, to give you a reason to defy the council that has shaped your entire existence. She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his storm-gray eyes. So yes, I have conditions. Name them. First, I continue my work. If there are people who need healing, I heal them. I won't spend these 7 days in hiding while others suffer. That will make you easier to track. Other executors are your problem, not mine. Second, you tell me your name. If we're going to spend a week together, I refuse to keep calling you executor. Names have power. Names have humanity. Something I suspect you've forgotten after 5 centuries of killing. She held his gaze steadily. What's your name? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Kieran. Kieran Blackthorn. Kieran? She repeated, tasting the name on her tongue. It suited him, sharp and strong and carrying the weight of old pain. My third condition is that you answer my questions honestly. If you want to understand why I do what I do, you need to be willing to examine why you do what you do. And if your questions become too personal, then you'll have learned something about the boundaries you've built around yourself. She extended her hand. Do we have an agreement? Kieran stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Centuries of conditioning warring against something newer, more uncertain. Finally, he reached out and took her hand in his. His skin was cold as she'd expected, but there was strength in his grip and something that might have been gentleness. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, a recognition that went deeper than mere physical attraction. 7 days, he said. But understand this, Dr. Cross, if you try to run, if you attempt to contact the council or any other vampires, if you do anything that suggests you're not taking this opportunity seriously, I will end this immediately. Understood. And Kieran? Yes? Call me Serafina. We're going to be spending a lot of time together. They made camp that night in a grove of ancient oaks, far enough from the village to avoid detection, but close enough that Serafina could return quickly if needed. Kieran moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent centuries living rough, setting up a shelter and building a fire with minimal effort. Serafina watched him work, noting the way he automatically positioned himself between her and any potential threats, the way his hand never strayed far from his sword, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Even offering her this chance, he remained what he was, a predator, a killer, a weapon honed by centuries of violence. "How long have you been an executor?" she asked as they settled beside the fire. 537 years, he replied without hesitation, since the Council's Enforcement Division was formally established. "And before that?" "Before that, I was what you might call a freelance problem solver. I killed vampires who broke our laws, humans who learned too much about our existence, and anyone else the Council deemed a threat to our survival." "You've been killing for over 5 centuries?" "I've been protecting our kind for over 5 centuries, he corrected, though there was something defensive in his tone. "The work I do ensures that vampires can exist without fear of exposure or persecution." "And how many have you killed in that time?" Kieran was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "I stopped counting after the 1st century. Hundreds? Thousands? Does it matter? It matters to me. I've spent 2 centuries saving lives. You've spent 5 centuries taking them. I want to understand how someone becomes what you are." "Someone becomes what I am through necessity," Kieran said, his voice flat. "Through understanding that sometimes death is the only way to preserve life. Through accepting that individual desires must be subordinated to the greater good." "And you've never questioned that? Never wondered if there might be another way?" "Questioning leads to hesitation. Hesitation leads to failure. Failure leads to exposure. And exposure leads to war between our species." He looked at her directly. "I've seen what happens when vampires are discovered by humans, Serafina. I've seen the massacres, the burnings, the absolute terror on both sides. The work I do prevents that. By killing anyone who might threaten the status quo. By maintaining the balance that keeps both species alive." Serafina leaned back against a tree trunk, studying his profile in the firelight. There was conviction in his voice, the absolute certainty of someone who had built their entire identity around a single purpose. But there was something else too, a weariness that spoke of doubts carefully suppressed, of questions that had been buried under centuries of duty. "Tell me about your first kill," she said softly. "Why?" "Because I want to understand when you stopped seeing individuals and started seeing threats." Kieran's jaw tightened. "That's not how it works." "Isn't it? When I look at humans, I see individuals, people with hopes and fears and dreams and the capacity for both great kindness and terrible cruelty. When you look at them, what do you see? I see potential problems, witnesses who might expose us, threats that need to be neutralized before they can spread. That's what you've trained yourself to see. But what did you see before? What did you see when you were young?" "I was never young," Kieran said sharply. "I was turned during the plague years when death was so common that one more body meant nothing. I learned early that sentiment was a luxury that could get you killed." "How old were you when you were turned?" 25. "And how long between your turning and your first kill?" Kieran was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. 3 days. 3 days, she repeated. "You were turned, and 3 days later you killed someone. Who was it?" "A human, a merchant who had seen my maker feeding and tried to blackmail him." Kieran's hands clenched into fists. "My maker told me it was a test, a way to prove my loyalty to our kind. He said that if I couldn't kill one human to protect all vampires, then I wasn't worthy of the gift he'd given me." "And you believed him?" "I was 3 days old, confused, terrified, and completely dependent on him for guidance. Yes, I believed him." "What was the merchant's name?" "What? The merchant. What was his name?" I don't remember." "You don't remember, or you never asked?" Kieran's expression darkened. "What difference does it make?" "It makes all the difference in the world. A name makes someone real, makes them human rather than just a target. It makes killing them personal rather than professional." Serafina leaned forward. "You've spent 5 centuries avoiding that personal connection because it would make your job impossible. My job is necessary. Your job is what you've been told is necessary. But have you ever questioned whether the Council's definition of necessity aligns with actual morality? Morality is a luxury we can't afford. Morality is the only thing that separates us from monsters." They stared at each other across the fire, the weight of their fundamental disagreement hanging between them like a sword. Finally, Kieran looked away. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "You've spent 2 centuries healing, creating, building something positive. I've spent 5 centuries destroying. I am what I am because that's what our survival required. And what if it didn't? What if there was another way to ensure vampire survival that didn't require so much death? There isn't. How do you know? Have you ever tried to find one?" Kieran didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. Serafina felt a pang of sympathy for this deadly, broken creature who had been shaped by violence and duty into something that barely remembered its own humanity. "Tell me about the council," she said, changing the subject. "How do they choose their targets? Vampires who break our laws. Humans who learn too much about our existence. Anyone who threatens the balance we've maintained for centuries. And who decides what constitutes a threat? The Council of Elders. 7 vampires, each over 1,000 years old, who have guided our kind through the darkest periods of human history. 7 vampires who have never walked among humans, never seen the good they're capable of, never witnessed the healing and growth and love that makes their lives worth preserving. 7 vampires who have seen what happens when our species come into conflict, who understand that coexistence is impossible. Is it? Or is that just what they've convinced themselves to justify centuries of control and manipulation?" Kieran's eyes flashed with anger. "You're talking about treason. I'm talking about truth. Kieran, in 2 centuries of working among humans, I've learned something that the Council refuses to acknowledge. Humans are capable of accepting us. Not all of them, perhaps not even most of them, but enough. There are humans who know what I am and work with me anyway. There are communities that have sheltered vampires for generations. There are possibilities that the Council refuses to explore because they threaten their absolute authority. And if you're wrong, if exposure leads to war, then we face that war with allies instead of facing it alone. We face it with humans who understand that not all vampires are monsters, who know that some of us choose to heal rather than harm. The Council will never accept that risk. The Council will never accept the loss of their power. There's a difference." They fell into silence again, each lost in their own thoughts. Serafina watched Kieran's face in the firelight, noting the way his expression shifted between certainty and doubt, between the conditioning of centuries and the questions that were clearly beginning to surface. "Day 1, she said finally. 6 more to go. 6 more to go," he agreed. "But Serafina? Yes? Don't mistake my willingness to listen for weakness. If you can't convince me, if you can't prove that your way is better than the Council's way, I will fulfill my duty." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because I've killed people I cared about before. I've executed vampires who were friends, humans who showed me kindness, anyone the Council deemed a threat. Don't assume that whatever this is between us will stay my hand if duty demands otherwise." The warning was clear, but Serafina heard something else in his voice. A plea, perhaps, or a challenge. He wanted to be convinced, she realized. He wanted her to give him a reason to choose something other than duty for the first time in 5 centuries. "I won't assume anything," she said. "But Kieran, don't assume that duty is the only thing worth living for. Sometimes the greatest courage is in choosing to change." The second day brought news of sickness in the nearby town of Ravenshollow, carried by a merchant who had stopped at their camp seeking directions. Serafina was packed and ready to leave within minutes despite Kieran's obvious reluctance. "This is exactly what the Council fears," he said, as they made their way through the forest. "Vampires involving themselves in human affairs, drawing attention, risking exposure. This is exactly what humanity needs," Serafina countered. "Someone with the knowledge and ability to help when their own medicine fails. And if someone recognizes what you are, if they see you working with medicines that shouldn't exist, healing with methods that seem impossible, then I deal with that when it happens. I won't let people die because of what might occur." Ravenshollow was larger than Millhaven, a proper town with cobblestone streets and buildings that spoke of modest prosperity. But the prosperity was overshadowed by the signs of illness. Houses marked with red X's to indicate infection, the smell of burning herbs meant to ward off disease, the unnatural quiet that came when people were too afraid to venture outside. Serafina went to work immediately, moving from house to house with Kieran trailing behind her like a dark shadow. She watched him as she worked, noting the way his expression changed as he observed her interactions with the sick and dying. In the first house, she treated a family of 5, Parents and 3 children all burning with fever and struggling to breathe. She worked for hours, adjusting treatments, monitoring progress, sitting with them through the worst of the crisis. When the youngest child, a boy of perhaps 8, finally opened his eyes and asked for water, his mother wept with relief. "Thank you," the woman whispered, clutching Serafina's hands. "Thank you for saving my babies." "Thank you for letting me help," Serafina replied, and she meant it. Each life saved was a gift, a reminder of why she had chosen this path despite the cost. In the second house, they found an elderly man living alone, too proud to ask for help, but too weak to care for himself. Serafina spent the afternoon nursing him back to health, preparing meals, cleaning his home, listening to stories of his late wife and the children who had moved to distant cities. "You remind me of my daughter," he told her as she prepared to leave. "She had your kindness, your gentle hands. Lost her to the fever 10 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Serafina said. And she was. Each story of loss, each tale of grief, added to the weight she carried. The knowledge of all the lives she hadn't been able to save, all the people who had died while she was elsewhere. In the third house, they found something that made even Kieran's carefully controlled expression crack. A young mother who had died in the night, leaving behind twin infants who were already showing signs of infection. The babies couldn't have been more than a few months old, and without intervention they would be dead within days. Serafina worked through the night, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to take its toll. She fed the infants medicines designed for adult systems, adjusted dosages with mathematical precision, monitored their tiny hearts with the enhanced hearing that was one of the few benefits of her vampiric nature. Kieran watched it all in silence, his storm-gray eyes tracking her every movement. When dawn broke and both babies were breathing easier, their fevers broken and their color returning to normal, he finally spoke. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why what? Why do this? Why risk everything for creatures that will live perhaps 80 years and then die anyway? Why care so much about individual lives when the universe is vast and time is infinite?" Serafina looked down at the sleeping infants, their tiny faces peaceful in the morning light. Because those 80 years matter. Because in those 80 years they might love someone, create something beautiful, make the world a little better than they found it. Because every life has value, regardless of how brief it might be. But you could live forever. You could see civilizations rise and fall, witness the birth and death of stars, experience things that no mortal could ever imagine. Why limit yourself to this? Because immortality without purpose is just an extended form of death. Because power without compassion is just another form of monstrosity. She looked at him directly. Because I'd rather spend eternity trying to heal the world than spend it watching it burn. And if your healing draws attention, if it leads to exposure and war, then at least I'll have tried to build something instead of just destroying it. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the sleeping babies and her face. The council would say you're naive. The council would say I'm dangerous. There's a difference. Is there? Naivety can be just as destructive as malice. Can it? Tell me, Kieran, in 5 centuries of killing, how many problems have you actually solved? How many threats have you eliminated only to see them replaced by new ones? How many times have you cut off one head only to watch 2 more grow back? That's not how it works, isn't it? You kill vampires who break the law, but more vampires break the law. You eliminate humans who learn about us, but more humans learn about us. You maintain the balance through violence, but the balance keeps shifting. Maybe the problem isn't that you're not killing enough people. Maybe the problem is that killing people isn't actually a solution. Then what is? Building something better. Creating relationships based on trust instead of fear. Showing humans that vampires can be allies instead of threats. She gestured toward the babies. Every life I save is a seed planted. Every person I heal goes back into the world with a different understanding of what vampires can be. And if those seeds grow into something that threatens our survival, then we adapt. We change. We become something worth surviving as. They left Raven's Hollow that afternoon, after Serafina had checked on all her patients one final time, and left detailed instructions for their continued care. The town was already beginning to return to normal. Shops reopening, people venturing into the streets, children playing in the squares where only days before there had been nothing but fear and death. 43 lives, Serafina said as they walked. 43 people who will see another sunset because someone chose to help instead of walking away. 43 people who now know that miraculous healing is possible. 43 people who might start asking questions about how such healing was accomplished. 43 people who might start believing that miracles are real, that there are forces in the world working for good instead of evil. And if they start looking for the source of those miracles, then they might find something worth believing in. They made camp that night beside a stream, the sound of running water providing a peaceful counterpoint to their ongoing debate. Kieran seemed more thoughtful than he had the previous evening. His responses less automatic, his questions more probing. "Tell me about your first save," he said as they settled beside their fire. "My first save? You asked me about my first kill. I'm asking about your first save. When did you decide to become a healer instead of a predator?" Serafina was quiet for a moment, memories flooding back from the early days of her vampiric existence. London, 1823. There was a cholera outbreak in the East End and I was hunting, looking for easy prey among the sick and dying. What changed? I found a woman in an alley, dying of the disease, holding her infant son. She was maybe 20 years old and she was using the last of her strength to keep the baby warm. Serafina's voice grew soft with remembrance. She looked up at me, and instead of fear, I saw hope. She thought I was there to help. And were you? I was there to feed. But when she pressed that baby into my arms and begged me to save him, something inside me broke. Or maybe something inside me finally started working properly. She looked at Kieran across the fire. I took them both to a physician I knew, used my enhanced speed to get them there before it was too late. The woman died, but the baby lived. And that changed everything. That changed me. I realized that I could use my abilities to preserve life instead of taking it. That I could be something other than a monster. What happened to the baby? I found him a good family, people who would love him and raise him well. I checked on him periodically over the years. He grew up to be a physician himself, spent his life helping others. She smiled at the memory. He died in 1891, an old man surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved him. All because one night I chose to save instead of destroy. And you never regretted it? Never wished you had chosen the easier path? Every day. But not because I regretted saving him. Because I regretted all the years I spent as a monster before that night. All the lives I took before I learned that I could give life instead. Kieran stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. The council would say you're living a lie. That vampires are predators by nature. That trying to be something else is denying what we are. The council would say that because it justifies their own choices. But Kieran, what we are and what we choose to be are two different things. Yes, we're predators. We're stronger, faster, more durable than humans. But that doesn't mean we have to use those abilities to harm. We can use them to protect, to heal, to build something better. And if our nature reasserts itself, if the hunger becomes too strong to resist, then we find ways to manage it that don't involve killing. I haven't killed a human in 2 centuries, Kieran. I feed from blood banks, from volunteers who understand what I am, from sources that don't require death. It's possible to be what we are without being monsters. The council maintains control by convincing vampires that they have no choice but to be killers. That morality is a luxury we can't afford. That compassion is a weakness that will get us destroyed. But what if they're wrong? What if the real threat to vampire survival isn't human discovery? What if it's becoming so monstrous that we deserve to be destroyed? Kieran looked at her sharply. You think we deserve extinction? I think we deserve whatever we choose to become. If we choose to be monsters, then yes, we deserve to be hunted and destroyed. But if we choose to be something better, if we choose to use our abilities to protect and heal and build, then we deserve to survive and thrive. And you think I can choose to be something better? The question was asked quietly, almost hesitantly, and Serafina heard the vulnerability beneath it. This was a man who had spent 5 centuries defining himself through violence, who had built his entire identity around being a weapon. The idea that he could be something else was both terrifying and tantalizing. I think you already are something better, she said softly. You're here, aren't you? You're questioning orders you've followed without doubt for 5 centuries. You're giving me a chance to prove that there's another way. That's not the action of a mindless killer. That's the action of someone who still has a conscience. Conscience is dangerous in my line of work. Conscience is what makes you human, regardless of what species you are. And if my conscience conflicts with my duty, then you'll have to decide which one matters more. They fell into silence again. But it was a different kind of silence than the previous night. Less confrontational, more contemplative. Serafina could see the war playing out behind Kieran's eyes. Centuries of conditioning battling against newly awakened doubts. Day 2, she said finally. Day 2, he agreed. 5 more to go. Are you keeping count for me or for you? Kieran's smile was barely visible in the firelight, but it was there. Maybe both. The 3rd day brought them to a mining town called Black Rock, where an explosion had trapped a dozen men underground. The local authorities had given up hope of rescue, declaring the mine too unstable for further attempts. But Serafina could hear them. Faint heartbeats, shallow breathing, the whispered prayers of men who refused to give up even when the world above had abandoned them. The mine could collapse completely, Kieran warned as she prepared her equipment. You could be killed or trapped yourself. Then you'll have to decide whether to dig me out or report my death to the council, she replied, checking her supplies one final time. Serafina, those men have families, Kieran. Wives and children who are waiting for them to come home. I won't let them die because of what might happen to me. She descended into the mine with Kieran following reluctantly behind, their enhanced vision allowing them to navigate the darkness that would have been impenetrable to humans. The air was thick with dust and the smell of fear, and every few minutes they could hear the ominous groan of timber supports strained beyond their limits. They found the trapped miners in a pocket of space created by fallen beams. 12 men who had been given up for dead, but who were still fighting to survive. Some were injured, broken bones, cuts from falling rock, the shallow breathing that spoke of internal damage. Others were simply exhausted, their strength sapped by hours of trying to dig their way out. Who are you? One of them asked, as Serafina knelt beside the most seriously injured man. Someone who's here to help, she replied, already assessing his condition. How long have you been trapped? Since yesterday morning. They tried to get us out, but he gestured at the unstable ceiling above them. Said it was too dangerous. It is dangerous, Serafina agreed, beginning to treat his injuries. But that doesn't mean we're giving up. She worked for hours, stabilizing the injured, treating shock and dehydration, using her enhanced strength to move debris that would have been impossible for humans to shift. Kieran helped, despite his obvious reluctance, his supernatural abilities making him invaluable in the cramped, dangerous space. You're not normal, are you? One of the miners asked as he watched Kieran lift a beam that should have required a team of men to move. No, Kieran replied simply. We're not. Don't care, the man said. Normal folks gave up on us. You didn't. It took them 6 hours to create a safe passage to the surface, working in shifts to shore up the tunnel while moving the injured men one by one. When the last miner was brought up into the sunlight, the crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers and tears of relief. Miracle? Someone whispered. It's a miracle. No miracle, Serafina said, exhaustion evident in her voice. Just people who refused to give up. But as they walked away from the celebration, Kieran was unusually quiet. Finally, Serafina couldn't stand the silence any longer. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that what we just did will be talked about for generations. 12 men rescued from an impossible situation by strangers with impossible abilities. Stories will be told, legends will grow, and eventually someone will start asking the right questions. And that terrifies you. It should terrify you too. The council has eyes and ears everywhere, Serafina. What we did today will reach them eventually, and when it does, they'll see that vampires can be heroes instead of monsters. They'll see that we can build instead of destroy. They'll see a threat to the order they've maintained for centuries. They'll see proof that you're exactly as dangerous as they believe you to be. Dangerous to their control, yes, but not dangerous to vampire survival. You're assuming they'll see the difference. I'm hoping they'll be forced to acknowledge it. They made camp that night in an abandoned cabin, its walls providing more shelter than their usual outdoor arrangements. Kieran built a fire in the old stone hearth, while Serafina tended to the cuts and bruises she'd acquired during the rescue. Let me, Kieran said, noticing her struggling to reach a gash on her shoulder. His touch was gentle as he cleaned and bandaged the wound, his fingers careful not to cause additional pain. This close, Serafina could see the details that distance had hidden. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the faint scars that marked his pale skin, the careful control he maintained over his supernatural strength. "You're very good at this," she observed. 5 centuries of battlefield medicine. You learn to patch people up when your job requires keeping them alive long enough to answer questions. Is that what you tell yourself? That the healing you do is just another form of violence? Kieran's hand stilled on her shoulder. What else would it be? Compassion, care, the same impulse that made you help those miners today, even though you knew it was dangerous. I helped because you needed assistance. It was tactical, not emotional. Was it? Because I saw your face when that last miner thanked us. I saw the way you looked when his wife threw her arms around him. That wasn't tactical calculation, Kieran. That was someone remembering what it felt like to be human. I'm not human. Neither am I. But we can choose to act with humanity. He finished bandaging her wound in silence, but she could feel the tension in his touch, the way his breathing had changed. When he was done, he didn't immediately move away, and for a moment they were frozen in that intimate space, close enough that she could feel the coolness of his skin, smell the faint scent of winter that seemed to cling to him. "Serafina," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her heart race. "Yes? What you're asking me to believe. It changes everything. If you're right, if there really is another way, then I've spent 5 centuries being wrong. I've killed people who didn't deserve to die, destroyed lives that could have been saved, served a cause that was built on fear instead of wisdom. And if I'm wrong, if you're wrong, then I'm betraying everything I've ever believed in for a beautiful lie. Which possibility scares you more?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his storm gray eyes searching her face. "Being wrong about what I've done, being right about what I might have to do." "You don't have to do anything, Kieran. You have a choice." "Do I?" "The Council doesn't tolerate failure, Serafina. If I don't complete this mission, if I don't bring them your head, they'll send someone else. Someone who won't give you 7 days to make your case. Then we'll face that when it happens." "We?" The word had slipped out before she'd thought about it, but now that it was spoken, she realized she meant it. "Yes, we. If you choose to stand with me, you won't be standing alone. You're talking about rebellion against the most powerful organization in vampire society. I'm talking about choosing what's right over what's easy. And you think I'm capable of that choice? I think you're the only one who can answer that question." Kieran moved away then, settling on the opposite side of the fire, but the distance felt charged with possibility. They were past the point of simple captor and prisoner, past the straightforward dynamic of hunter and prey. Something was building between them. Attraction, yes, but more than that. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition of kindred spirits who had chosen different paths, but were beginning to see that those paths might converge. "Tell me about the Council," Serafina said, breaking the silence. "Not their official history, but what they're really like. Who they really are. Ancient. Powerful. Absolutely convinced of their own righteousness." Kieran stared into the fire. "They've ruled vampire society for over 1,000 years, and in that time they've never once admitted to being wrong about anything. What are they afraid of? Exposure. War. The destruction of everything they've built. No. What are they really afraid of? What keeps them awake during the day?" Kieran considered the question. Irrelevance. The possibility that vampires might not need them anymore. That we might be able to survive and thrive without their guidance and control. "And you? What are you afraid of?" "That you're right. That I've wasted 5 centuries serving a lie." He looked at her across the fire. "That I'm too broken to be anything other than what I am." "You're not broken, Kieran. You're just bent. Shaped by circumstances and choices that weren't entirely your own. But metal can be reshaped, if you're willing to endure the heat required to make it malleable again. And if the reshaping destroys what was there before, then maybe what was there before needed to be destroyed. Even if it means losing everything I am. Especially if it means becoming everything you could be." They talked long into the night, their conversation ranging from philosophy to personal history, from the nature of morality to the weight of individual choice. With each exchange, Serafina could see Kieran's certainty eroding, replaced by something more complex and ultimately more human: doubt, hope, and the terrifying possibility of change. "Day 3, she said as the fire burned low. "Day 3, he agreed. 4 more to go. Are you starting to see it? The possibility I'm talking about? Kieran was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'm starting to see you. And that might be the most dangerous thing of all. The 4th day brought them to a crossroads, literally and figuratively. The path ahead split into 3 directions, one leading to a large city where Serafina's skills would be needed, but where the risk of discovery was highest, one leading to a remote village where they could hide, but where people might be dying without help, and one leading away from human settlements entirely, toward the wilderness where they could avoid complications, but also avoid purpose. Which way? Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. The city, Serafina said without hesitation. There's a hospital there, physicians who are struggling with diseases they don't understand. I can help them, teach them, save lives that would otherwise be lost. The city is also where the council's informants are most likely to be, where news of unusual healing spreads fastest, where we're most likely to be discovered. Then we'll have to be careful. Careful doesn't eliminate risk, it just reduces it. Nothing worthwhile is without risk, Kieran. The question is whether the potential good outweighs the potential harm. And you believe it does? I believe that hiding in the wilderness while people die in the city is a form of moral cowardice. I believe that if we have the power to help, we have the responsibility to use it, even if using it destroys us. Especially then, what good is survival if it comes at the cost of everything that makes survival worthwhile? They took the road to the city. Millbrook was a sprawling metropolis of nearly 50,000 souls, its streets crowded with merchants and laborers, its air thick with the smoke of industry and the scent of too many people living too close together. It was exactly the kind of place where disease could spread like wildfire, where the poor died in alleys while the rich paid for physicians who knew little more than bloodletting and prayer. Serafina made her way to the city's largest hospital, a grim stone building that served more as a warehouse for the dying than a place of healing. She presented herself as a traveling physician, her credentials carefully forged but her knowledge undeniably real. We're overwhelmed, Dr. Sue Harrison, the chief physician, told her as he showed her through the wards. 3 different diseases, all spreading faster than we can treat them. We've lost more patients this month than we saved. What treatments are you using? The usual. Bloodletting, purging, prayer. Nothing seems to work. Serafina bit back her first response, that the usual treatments were killing more people than they saved, and instead focused on what she could do to help. May I examine some of the patients? Of course, though I warn you, we've had physicians from London, from Edinburgh, from as far away as Vienna. None of them have been able to do much good. Perhaps a fresh perspective will help. She spent the day moving through the wards, her enhanced senses allowing her to diagnose conditions that the human physicians had missed entirely. The first disease was bacterial, easily treatable with the right antibiotics. The second was viral, requiring supportive care and isolation to prevent spread. The third was actually poisoning from contaminated water, requiring nothing more than a clean source and time for the toxins to clear the system. All 3 were killing people because the physicians didn't understand what they were treating. Dr. Cross, Dr. Harrison called, as she finished examining a young woman who was dying of what he'd diagnosed as consumption, but which was actually pneumonia. What's your assessment? Treatable, she said simply. All of it. But we need to change our approach entirely. What do you mean? I mean that bloodletting a patient who's already weakened by disease is like trying to put out a fire by removing the water. I mean that purging someone who's dehydrated from fever is like trying to fill a bucket by pouring out what little water it contains. But these are established treatments proven over centuries. Proven to fail, yes. Dr. Harrison, what if I told you that I could save 90% of the patients in this hospital? What if I told you that most of these people don't have to die? I'd say you were either a miracle worker or a madman. Then let me show you. She worked through the night with Kieran watching from the shadows as she moved from patient to patient. She introduced concepts that wouldn't be discovered for decades. Antiseptic techniques, proper hydration, targeted treatments based on actual diagnosis rather than guesswork. The results were immediate and dramatic. Patients who had been dying began to recover. Fevers broke, breathing eased. The gray pallor of approaching death gave way to the flush of returning health. Impossible, Dr. Harrison whispered, as he watched a child who had been unconscious for days sit up and ask for her mother. "How are you doing this?" "Knowledge," Serafina replied, which was true as far as it went, "and a willingness to question assumptions that aren't working." "But where did you learn these techniques? What medical school teaches such methods?" "Experience teaches them. Observation, trial and error, the willingness to admit when something isn't working and try something else." By dawn, word of the miraculous healings had spread throughout the city. People began arriving at the hospital not just seeking treatment, but wanting to see the physician who could bring the dead back to life. Serafina found herself surrounded by crowds, by desperate families, by physicians from other hospitals who wanted to learn her methods. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Kieran said as they finally escaped the hospital and made their way through the city's back streets. "You've drawn too much attention. There will be questions, investigations, people trying to understand how you accomplished what you did. And maybe some of those people will learn something that helps them save lives in the future. Maybe some of those physicians will take what I've shown them and use it to help their own patients. And maybe some of those people will realize that what you did was impossible for a normal human. Maybe they'll start asking questions about who you really are and what you really are. Then we'll deal with that when it happens." "Will we?" "Because I'm starting to think that you don't fully understand the consequences of exposure. You see the good that could come from humans accepting vampires, but you don't see the chaos that would come first." "Don't I?" "Kieran, I've lived through human wars, human plagues, human atrocities that would make your council's worst nightmares seem tame by comparison. I've seen what humans are capable of when they're afraid, when they're angry, when they're convinced that their survival depends on destroying something else. Then how can you believe that exposure would lead to anything other than war? Because I've also seen what humans are capable of when they're inspired, when they're hopeful, when they're convinced that their survival depends on building something better. I've seen them sacrifice themselves for strangers, dedicate their lives to healing, choose love over fear even when fear would be easier. And you think that side of humanity would win? I think that side of humanity is worth fighting for." They found shelter in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far enough from the hospital to avoid immediate discovery, but close enough that Serafina could return if needed. As they settled in for the day, Kieran seemed more troubled than she'd seen him since their first meeting. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I'm starting to understand why the council fears you. Because I save lives? Because you inspire hope. Because you make people believe that impossible things are possible, that the world can be better than it is." He looked at her with something that might have been awe. "Do you know what you did back there? You didn't just heal those people. You changed the way an entire hospital thinks about medicine. You planted seeds that will grow into treatments and techniques that could save thousands of lives over the coming decades. And that's a bad thing? It's a dangerous thing. Hope is the most powerful force in the universe, Serafina. It can move mountains, topple empires, change the fundamental nature of reality. But it can also destroy everything in its path if it's not carefully controlled. And do you think hope should be controlled? I think hope should be managed, directed, kept within bounds that don't threaten the stability of the world." "Whose bounds? Decided by whom? The council? Decided by those with the wisdom and experience to understand the consequences of change." "You mean decided by those with the power to maintain their own positions regardless of whether that's what's best for everyone else?" Kieran was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. But what's the alternative? Chaos? Revolution? The destruction of everything that's been built over centuries of careful balance? The alternative is growth, evolution. The possibility that what's been built over centuries might not be worth preserving if it requires so much suffering to maintain. And if you're wrong, if the growth you're talking about leads to destruction instead of improvement, then at least we'll have tried to build something better instead of just maintaining something broken. You're asking me to bet everything on your vision of what could be. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that what isn't the same thing as what should be." They fell into silence, but it was a charged silence, heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be postponed much longer. Serafina could see the war playing out behind Kieran's eyes. Centuries of conditioning battling against newly awakened possibilities, duty warring with conscience, fear struggling against hope. "Day 4, she said finally. "Day 4, he agreed. 3 more to go. Are you ready to make your choice? I don't know. Are you ready to live with the consequences of whatever choice I make? I've been ready for that since the moment I chose to become a healer instead of a killer. Even if my choice means your death? Even then. Because at least I'll die knowing that I tried to show you another way. And if my choice means betraying everything I've ever believed in? Then you'll live knowing that you chose growth over stagnation, hope over fear, love over duty. Love? The word hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Serafina felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what she'd revealed. But she didn't take it back. Yes, she said simply. Love. For humanity. For the possibility of something better. For the man you could choose to become instead of the weapon you were made to be. Kieran stared at her for a long moment, his storm gray eyes searching her face. Serafina, I know it's complicated. I know it changes things, but it's the truth and I won't apologize for it. You love someone who's killed more people than you've saved. Someone who came here to execute you for the crime of showing compassion. Someone who represents everything you've spent 2 centuries fighting against. I love someone who's questioning 5 centuries of conditioning because he saw the value in what I do. Someone who's risking everything he's ever known to give me a chance to prove that there's another way. Someone who's brave enough to consider that he might have been wrong. And if I decide that I haven't been wrong, if I choose duty over whatever this is between us, then I'll face that choice with the knowledge that for 7 days I made you think. For 7 days I made you question. For 7 days you remembered what it felt like to be more than just a weapon. Kieran moved closer, his expression intense. You're playing a dangerous game, Serafina. I'm not playing anything. This is my life, my choice, my truth, and yes, it's dangerous. Love always is. Love is a luxury we can't afford. Love is the only thing that makes survival worthwhile. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of silver in his storm gray eyes, could feel the coolness of his skin, could smell the faint scent of winter that clung to him. For a moment she thought he might close the distance between them, might give in to the attraction that had been building since their first meeting. Instead, he stepped back, his expression closing off. 3 more days, he said quietly. 3 more days to convince me that your way is better than the council's way. And then we'll both find out what I'm really capable of choosing. The 5th day brought news that changed everything. They were awakened before dawn by the sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching at speed. Kieran was on his feet instantly, his sword in his hand, his body positioned between Serafina and the approaching threat. Council forces, he said grimly, his enhanced hearing picking up details that were still beyond her perception. At least 6 riders, all vampires, all armed. How did they find us? Does it matter? They're here. The riders surrounded the warehouse within minutes, their black horses and darker clothing making them look like harbingers of death in the pre-dawn gloom. Their leader dismounted and approached the building's entrance with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being feared. Executor Blackthorn, the leader called out, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. By order of the council, you will surrender the traitor Serafina Cross immediately. Commander Voss, Kieran replied, though he didn't lower his sword. I wasn't expecting company. Weren't you? It's been 5 days since you were dispatched to eliminate a single target. The council grows, concerned about your progress. The target has proven more elusive than anticipated. Has she? Because our sources tell us that a vampire matching her description has been healing humans in 3 different locations over the past 4 days. Hardly the behavior of someone who's trying to remain elusive. Serafina felt her heart sink. Of course the council had informants. She'd been naive to think that her activities would go unnoticed indefinitely. Sources can be unreliable, Kieran said carefully. Can they? Then you won't mind if we search the premises, just to ensure that you haven't been compromised by your target. I would mind, actually. My methods are my own, Commander. The council sent me to complete a mission, not to be supervised like a novice. The council sent you to kill a traitor, not to spend nearly a week in her company. There's a difference. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Serafina could see the way Kieran's grip tightened on his sword. This was the moment of truth. Would he stand with her, or would he hand her over to save himself? Commander, Kieran said finally, his voice deadly quiet. I suggest you and your men withdraw. I don't take kindly to interference in my work, and I don't take kindly to executors who forget their place. Stand aside, Blackthorn. This doesn't have to end badly for you. Doesn't it? Kieran's smile was sharp as a blade, because I'm starting to think that ending badly might be exactly what this situation requires. The fight that followed was brief, but vicious. 6 council enforcers against 1 executor and a healer who had spent 2 centuries avoiding violence. Under normal circumstances, the outcome would have been predetermined, but these weren't normal circumstances. Kieran fought with the skill of 5 centuries of combat experience, but more than that, he fought with the desperate fury of someone who had finally found something worth protecting. His sword sang through the air, finding gaps in armor and weaknesses in defense with surgical precision. Serafina did what she could to help, using her enhanced speed and strength to stay out of the way while providing support when possible. She wasn't a warrior, but she was a survivor, and she'd learned a few tricks over the centuries. When the dust settled, 4 enforcers lay dead and 2 had fled into the forest. Commander Voss was among the dead, his expression frozen in surprise at the betrayal he hadn't seen coming. "Well," Kieran said, wiping blood from his blade, "I suppose that settles the question of where my loyalties lie." "You chose," Serafina said, hardly daring to believe it. "I chose, though I have to admit, I'm not entirely certain what I've chosen. You've chosen to stand against tyranny, to fight for the possibility of something better. I've chosen to commit treason against the most powerful organization in vampire society. I've chosen to become a fugitive, a target, an enemy of everything I've served for 5 centuries. Do you regret it?" Kieran looked at her, his storm gray eyes holding a mixture of fear and determination and something that might have been love. "Ask me again in 100 years. They fled the warehouse immediately, knowing that the surviving enforcers would return with reinforcements. As they rode through the forest, Serafina found herself marveling at the magnitude of what had just happened. Kieran Blackthorne, the council's most trusted executor, had just declared war on his former masters. "Where do we go now?" she asked as they paused to rest their horses. "Away from here. Away from anywhere the council might expect to find us." Kieran's expression was grim. "They'll send everything they have after us now. Every executor, every enforcer, every vampire who owes them loyalty or fears their wrath. And you think we can survive that? I think we have to try, because the alternative is letting them win, and I'm not ready to do that." "What changed your mind? What made you choose to stand with me?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Watching you work, seeing the way you looked at those people, not as potential threats or convenient tools, but as individuals worth saving, realizing that in 5 centuries of killing, I'd never once felt the satisfaction that you get from healing a single person, and realizing that I'd rather spend whatever time I have left trying to build something than spend it destroying what others have built, even if it means being hunted for the rest of your existence. Especially then, because at least I'll be hunted for something I believe in rather than something I was told to believe in." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The landscape around them was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in wildflowers, streams that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds, forests that whispered with the promise of sanctuary. "Kieran," Serafina said finally. "Yes? Thank you for choosing to see past what you were taught to what could be possible. Thank you for showing me that there was something to see. What happens now? Now we disappear. We find somewhere the council can't reach us and we figure out how to build the world you've been dreaming of. Just the 2 of us? To start with, but I have a feeling that once word spreads about what we're trying to do, we won't be alone for long. You think other vampires will join us? I think there are more vampires like you than the council wants to admit. Vampires who are tired of being monsters, who want to be something better, who are just waiting for someone to show them that it's possible. And humans? Do you think they'll accept us? Some will, others won't. But that's true of any relationship between different groups. The key is to focus on those who are willing to try, rather than those who are determined to hate. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." They made camp that night in a cave hidden deep in the mountains, far from any human settlement but with a clear view of the approaches. As they settled beside their fire, Serafina found herself studying Kieran's profile in the flickering light. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The certainty of knowing exactly what you were supposed to do?" "Sometimes," he admitted. There was a simplicity to following orders, to having someone else make the difficult decisions. But there was also a kind of death in it, the death of choice, of growth, of the possibility of becoming something more than what you were made to be. And now? Now I'm terrified and exhilarated and more alive than I've felt in centuries." He looked at her across the fire. "Now I'm free to choose who I want to be rather than being trapped by who I was told to be. And who do you want to be? Someone worthy of the faith you've shown in me. Someone who builds instead of destroys. Someone who—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Someone who what? Someone who deserves to be loved by someone like you?" The admission hung between them like a bridge finally completed. Serafina felt her heart race as she saw the vulnerability in his expression, the way he was offering her something precious and fragile. "Kieran, I know it's complicated. I know I have centuries of blood on my hands, that I represent everything you fought against. But I also know that what I feel for you is the most real thing I've experienced in 500 years. What do you feel? Love, admiration, gratitude for showing me that there was another way to exist?" He moved around the fire, kneeling beside her. "Hope for a future I never thought possible. And fear? Terrified that I'll disappoint you, that I'll revert to what I was when things get difficult, that I'm too broken to be what you need me to be." Serafina reached out, cupping his face in her hands. "You're not broken, Kieran, you're just unfinished. We all are. The question isn't whether you're perfect, it's whether you're willing to keep growing. And if I am, then we'll grow together." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who had spent centuries believing he was incapable of gentleness. His lips were cool against hers, but there was warmth in the way he held her, reverence in the way his hands tangled in her hair. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love your compassion, your courage, your absolute refusal to accept that the world has to be the way it is." "I love you too," she replied. "I love your strength, your willingness to question everything you've been taught, your choice to stand with me even when it meant losing everything else. Not everything else. I'm gaining something infinitely more valuable." "What's that?" "A reason to believe that the future can be better than the past." They made love that night with the tenderness of two people who had found something precious in the midst of chaos. There was passion, yes, but there was also reverence, the recognition that what they had built together was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the risks they were taking. Afterward, as they lay entwined beside the dying fire, Serafina felt a peace she hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since she'd chosen to become a healer, she wasn't alone in her mission. She had a partner, an ally, someone who understood both the cost and the value of choosing compassion over convenience. "Day 6, she said softly. "Day 6, Kieran agreed. "Though I suppose the 7-day deadline is somewhat academic now." "Is it? You still haven't told me definitively that you believe my way is better than the Council's way." "Haven't I? I think killing 4 Council enforcers and becoming a fugitive from vampire law was a fairly definitive statement. That was a statement about where your loyalties lie. I'm asking about your beliefs." Kieran was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I believe that you've shown me possibilities I never knew existed. I believe that the Council's way leads to stagnation and fear, while your way leads to growth and hope. I believe that love is stronger than duty, that compassion is more powerful than control, that building is more valuable than destroying. And I believe that we can create something better than what came before. Not easily, not without cost, but possible, even if it means war with the Council. Especially then, because some things are worth fighting for, and the right to choose love over fear is one of them." Serafina smiled, feeling the last of her doubts dissolve. "Then we're really doing this. We're really going to try to change the world. We're really going to try to change the world. Any regrets?" "Only one." "What's that?" "That it took me 5 centuries to find you." The 7th day dawned clear and bright, with the promise of spring in the air and the sound of birdsong echoing through the mountains. They broke camp early, knowing that their pursuers wouldn't be far behind, but there was a lightness to their movements that hadn't been there before. "Where to?" Kieran asked as they prepared to ride out. "North," Serafina said without hesitation. "There are communities in the northern territories that have been isolated from Council influence, places where we can begin building something new. And if the Council follows us, then we'll be ready for them. But Kieran, I don't think we'll be fighting alone for long." "What do you mean?" "I mean that what happened yesterday, a Council executor choosing to stand against his former masters, that news will spread. There will be other vampires who hear that story and realize that change is possible. There will be humans who learn that not all vampires are monsters. There will be communities that choose cooperation over conflict. You're talking about a revolution. I'm talking about evolution. The natural progression from fear-based survival to hope-based growth. And you think we can lead that evolution? I think we can inspire it. We can show others that it's possible to choose differently, to be something more than what we were made to be. They rode north through landscapes that grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile. As they traveled, they talked about their plans, the communities they would seek out, the alliances they would try to build, the challenges they would face and overcome together. "There's something I need to tell you," Kieran said as they paused to rest beside a mountain stream. "What?" "The council won't give up easily. They'll send everything they have after us. Executors, enforcers, armies if necessary. They'll turn other vampires against us, spread lies about our intentions, do whatever it takes to maintain their control." "I know. And there will be times when the cost seems too high, when the sacrifices required seem too great. There will be moments when you'll wonder if we made the right choice." "Will there?" "Because I can't imagine any cost being too high for the chance to build something better. Even if that cost is your life, my life, the lives of people we care about?" Serafina was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Kieran, I've spent 2 centuries watching people die from diseases I could cure, from injuries I could heal, from problems I could solve, all because I was afraid of the consequences of revealing what I was. I've let fear dictate my choices, and I've paid for that caution with the lives of people I might have saved. And I'm done letting fear make my decisions. Yes, there will be costs. Yes, there will be sacrifices. But there will also be possibilities that we can't even imagine yet. There will be a future where vampires and humans work together instead of hiding from each other. There will be a world where power is used to heal instead of harm. You really believe that's possible? I believe it's inevitable. The only question is whether we'll be part of building it or part of trying to prevent it. Then we'd better make sure we're on the right side of history. We already are." As they continued their journey north, Serafina felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with reaching their destination. For 7 days she had argued for the possibility of change, for the value of choosing compassion over control. For 7 days Kieran had questioned everything he'd been taught, everything he'd believed, everything he'd built his identity around. And in the end, they had both chosen love. Not just love for each other, though that was part of it. Love for humanity, for the possibility of growth, for the future they could build together. Love for the idea that individuals could choose to be better than their nature, better than their conditioning, better than their fears. "Day 7, she said as the sun began to set behind the mountains. "Day 7, Kieran agreed. "The end of our agreement. And the beginning of everything else. Are you ready for everything else?" "With you, I'm ready for anything." As they rode into the gathering darkness, 2 fugitives from vampire law heading toward an uncertain future, Serafina felt the weight of 2 centuries of loneliness lifting from her shoulders. She was no longer alone in her mission to heal the world. She had a partner, an ally, a love that had been forged in the crucible of impossible choices and emerged stronger for the testing. Behind them lay 5 centuries of unquestioned obedience to laws that prioritized control over compassion. Ahead lay the possibility of building something new, something better, something worthy of the sacrifices that would be required to achieve it. The council would come for them. That was certain. There would be battles to fight, obstacles to overcome, prices to pay that they couldn't yet imagine. But there would also be allies to find, communities to build, lives to save, and futures to create. And through it all, they would have each other. "I love you," Kieran said as they crested a hill and saw the lights of a distant village twinkling in the valley below. "I love you too," Serafina replied. "Now let's go change the world. Together, together." As they rode down into the valley, toward the first community that would learn that vampires could be healers instead of hunters, protectors instead of predators, allies instead of enemies, the stars came out overhead, countless points of light in the darkness, each one a possibility, each one a promise that the future could be brighter than the past. And in that moment, anything seemed possible. What an absolutely breathtaking transformation from duty-bound killer to love-struck revolutionary. I'm still emotional from watching Kieran question 5 centuries of conditioning, because he witnessed Serafina's pure compassion in action. The way their 7-day deadline became a countdown not to her death, but to his rebirth as someone capable of choosing love over law. That was absolutely masterful storytelling. And can we talk about that moment when he chose to fight the council enforcers? The way he literally chose her over everything he'd ever known and believed in? That gave me chills. What did you think of Serafina's approach to changing his mind? Was her strategy of showing rather than telling the most effective way to reach someone so deeply conditioned? If you loved this epic tale of redemption, forbidden love, and the courage to choose compassion over control, please hit that subscribe button. I have so many more incredible stories waiting for you. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Kieran and Serafina can really build the revolution they're dreaming of? Or are they too naive about the council's power? And here's something that's been haunting me. Was Kieran's transformation believable? Or would 5 centuries of conditioning be too strong to overcome in just 7 days? Next week, I'm bringing you another heart-stopping supernatural romance. Dragon Lord's daughter, disguised as human servant, he's been searching for her for 300 years. Trust me, you won't want to miss that emotional masterpiece.